So I really enjoyed playing her. When I first wanted to be in it, I was told, no, they don't want anyone who's ever done science fiction to be in this movie.
Imagine a sci-fi comedy so plagued by disasters that its original legendary director walked off the project in pure disgust. The lead actors were constantly on the verge of breakdown, and a major Hollywood studio tried to totally butcher its identity in the editing room. Yet, somehow, this chaotic mess defied every single law of Hollywood physics to become a legendary masterpiece. How did a goofy parody manage to completely out-trek Star Trek? The shocking truth behind the madness starts right now. The original R-rated dark cut. When audiences originally sat down to watch this movie in theaters, they treated it like a lighthearted, family-friendly space adventure. But the film's original creative DNA was vastly darker, edgier, and packed with mature content that would have completely changed its legacy. In its initial conception, the movie was written as a cynical, biting, R-rated dark comedy that focused heavily on the absolute misery and psychological decay of washed-up, desperate actors. The original director, along with the screenwriters, wanted to emphasize the sheer existential dread of being trapped in the vicious loop of sci-fi conventions. The early drafts included incredibly foul language, highly suggestive adult jokes, and a far more graphic depiction of the violence infatuation of the alien species. Characters were meant to scream intense profanities as they faced horrific alien monsters. And the genuine terror of being stranded in the cold vacuum of outer space was played for visceral adult shock value rather than light humor. DreamWorks executives ultimately panicked when they saw how intense the early cuts were, realizing they had a potential box office disaster if families couldn't buy tickets. They forced massive, sweeping edits to secure a PG rating, leaving an entire alternative, pitch-black version of the film locked away forever in the studio vaults. How did the studio manage to save this crumbling project after such a hostile corporate restructuring? Harold Ramis formally quit over casting. Before the movie found its ultimate creative groove, comedy royalty Harold Ramis was officially hired to direct the project. Ramis, the brilliant mind behind Ghostbusters and Groundhog Day, had a very specific, deeply grounded vision for how the sci-fi parody should function. However, everything completely collapsed the moment casting discussions began. Ramis was absolutely dead set on securing a traditional dramatic powerhouse actor like Alec Baldwin or Kevin Costner to play the lead role of Jason Nesmith, believing the character needed a classic Hollywood leading man gravitas to balance out the inherent absurdity of the script. When the studio executives brought up the idea of hiring Tim Allen, Ramis was completely aghast. He firmly believed that casting a prominent television sitcom star would turn the movie into a cheap, superficial joke, rather than the sophisticated, elevated satire he was aiming to create. The creative disagreements quickly became incredibly hostile and entirely unresolvable. Realizing that the studio was determined to force Tim Allen down his throat, Ramis chose to completely walk away from the movie, formally quitting the production in a state of utter frustration because he simply refused to attach his legendary name to what he assumed would be a massive, unmitigated disaster. The script was written by a direct-to-video horror alum. You would naturally assume that a sci-fi comedy script this incredibly tight, clever, and endlessly quotable must have been written by an established comedy mastermind or a veteran of high-profile studio blockbusters. In reality, the foundational script for this brilliant satire came from the mind of David Howard, a writer whose previous resume was largely filled with obscure, low-budget, direct-to-video horror movies and forgotten thrillers. Howard's background in writing genuine tension and schlocky genre fiction was actually the secret weapon that made the screenplay work so incredibly well, because he fundamentally understood the structural mechanics of actual B-movies, monster flicks, and classic sci-fi tropes. He didn't just write a series of disconnected, superficial jokes. Instead, he approached the narrative by treating the absurd stakes of the space adventure with total, unironic seriousness. When writer Robert Gordon was later brought in to polish the dialogue and amplify the specific comedic elements, he kept Howard's rock-solid genre framework completely intact. It was this bizarre, unlikely combination of a gritty, low-budget horror writer's structural sensibilities and high-concept Hollywood comedy polishing that allowed the final film to seamlessly balance genuine, white-knuckle sci-fi tension with brilliant, laugh-out-loud character comedy. The secret meaning behind the NSEA Protector. Every single hardcore sci-fi franchise needs a cool-sounding, deeply official acronym for its central military organization or exploratory space fleet. In Star Trek, you have Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets. But for this movie, the fictional television show featured the grand-sounding NSEA Protector. To the average viewer, these letters sound like a perfectly standard militaristic space agency. But the writers actually hid a very specific, brilliant Easter egg directly within the acronym itself. The letters SEA officially stand for National Space Exploration Administration. While that sounds incredibly professional on the surface, the creative team deliberately chose those exact words to create a highly subtle, tongue-in-cheek joke about bureaucratic redundancy. If you break down the actual real-world mechanics of space travel, a national agency exploring the infinite, borderless expanse of deep outer space is completely illogical, highlighting how small-minded and Earth-centric the fictional TV writers were. Furthermore, the design of the ship itself was meticulously crafted to look just slightly cheap and impractical from certain angles, reflecting the budget limitations of a fictional 80s television show while still retaining enough genuine cinematic beauty to look absolutely stunning during the movie's massive, high-budget special effects sequences. Tim Allen beat out Kevin Costner and Alec Baldwin. It is almost completely impossible to imagine anyone other than Tim Allen playing the arrogant, swaggering, yet secretly insecure Jason Nesmith. His performance perfectly captures the exact essence of a washed-up sci-fi television captain, but he was incredibly far from being the studio's first choice for the role. As the production initially got underway, the casting directors were aggressively hunting for prestigious, traditional A-list Hollywood movie stars to anchor the film. The role was actively offered to Kevin Costner, who was a massive box office draw at the time, but he ultimately turned it down to pursue other projects. Alec Baldwin was also heavily considered and eyed for the part, as the creative team thought his booming voice and intense dramatic presence would make for a hilarious parody of William Shatner. Even comedy megastar Bruce Willis was briefly in the conversation. Tim Allen, who was primarily known at the time for his hit family sitcom Home Improvement and voicing Buzz Lightyear, had to fight incredibly hard to convince the skeptical studio that he possessed the actual dramatic range and leading man energy required to carry a big-budget sci-fi feature film, ultimately winning the part and changing his career forever. Alan Rickman's pure, unadulterated midlife crisis. The legendary Alan Rickman delivered an absolute masterclass in comedic acting as Sir Alexander Dane, the Shakespearean theater actor who is utterly miserable about being eternally trapped in the shadow of his alien character, Dr. Lazarus. What makes his performance so deeply hilarious and incredibly authentic is that Rickman was drawing directly from his own real-life frustrations and existential dread as an actor. Rickman was a classically trained, highly prestigious British stage actor who who often found himself widely recognized by global audiences primarily for playing mainstream Hollywood villains like Hans Gruber in Die Hard or Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin Hood. He channeled that exact, deeply personal irritation over being typecast directly into his character. On the set, Rickman would frequently stay in character between takes, muttering under his breath, and looking completely exhausted by the sheer absurdity of the production around him. His brilliant choice to play Alexander Dane not as a silly caricature, but as a genuinely grieving, deeply depressed artistic soul who truly believes his profound talent is being utterly wasted, provided the entire movie with its most grounded, surprisingly emotional, and endlessly hilarious character arc: Sigourney Weaver's blonde ambition and low-cut mandate. Sigourney Weaver is widely considered the ultimate, undisputed queen of serious, badass science fiction, thanks to her iconic, groundbreaking role as Ellen Ripley in the Alien franchise. Because she was so deeply associated with playing fiercely intelligent, intensely pragmatic survivalists, she jumped at the absolute chance to do something completely different for this film. Weaver actively chose to play Gwen DeMarco as a highly specific parody of how old-school, male-dominated 70s and 80s sci-fi television shows treated their female cast members. She insisted on wearing a strikingly bright, exaggeratedly blonde wig and squeezed into an incredibly restrictive, ridiculously low-cut uniform that was designed to get progressively lower as the movie went on. Weaver found the absolute absurdity of her character's fictional job, simply repeating whatever the ship's computer said, to be an incredibly funny commentary on Hollywood sexism. She threw herself into the role with total unironic enthusiasm, frequently joking on set that her character's primary, most vital biological function on the ship was to look incredibly attractive for the television ratings, turning a potentially flat character into a brilliant, highly subversive, comedic performance. Sam Rockwell baselined his performance on a tragic red shirt. Sam Rockwell's performance as Guy Fleegman, the terrified extra who is utterly convinced he is going to be brutally killed because he doesn't have a last name, is widely considered the absolute breakout comedic element of the entire film. To prepare for this highly specific, anxiety-ridden role, Rockwell didn't just read the script. He meticulously studied old episodes of the original Star Trek series, focusing entirely on the nameless, disposable security guards, colloquially known by fans as red shirts. He noticed a highly specific, hilarious pattern. These doomed actors always looked completely terrified, possessed zero backstory, and existed purely to be disintegrated by alien monsters to show the audience that the situation was dangerous. Rockwell decided to base his entire performance on the psychological trauma of a character who is actively aware of these narrative tropes. He chose to play Guy as someone suffering from a literal, ongoing panic attack, constantly screaming, hyperventilating, and frantically scanning his surroundings for potential narrative traps. His brilliant improvisational skills and frantic physical comedy brought an entirely unique, meta-level energy to the screen, perfectly capturing the existential horror of being a disposable background extra trapped in a real-world space nightmare. Tony Shalhoub was supposed to be the guy who dies. When you watch the final cut of the film, Tony Shalhoub's character, Fred Kwan, is an absolute fan favorite due to his incredibly bizarre, hilariously relaxed, and completely unflappable demeanor in the face of literal alien warfare. However, according to the original screenplay, Fred Kwan was never actually supposed to survive the events of the movie. In the early drafts of the script, his character was written as a fairly standard, slightly anxious tech guy who was explicitly destined to be tragically killed off during one of the dangerous alien encounters in the second half of the story to raise the stakes for the rest of the crew. But the moment Shalhoub stepped onto the set and began interacting with the rest of the cast, he completely transformed the character's entire vibe. He chose to play Fred as someone who was constantly, blissfully spaced out. A creative choice that led many fans to assume the character was heavily medicated or high throughout the entire mission. The director and producers found Shalhoub's bizarrely serene, ultra-chill reactions to life-threatening danger so incredibly funny that they immediately ordered rewrites to save his life. How did an unexpected technical glitch on set completely redefine the movie's most iconic alien species? The Thermians' high-pitched voices were an on-set accident. The Thermians, the innocent, hyper-literal alien race who mistake the actors' old television broadcasts for actual historical documents, are famous for their incredibly distinct, highly eccentric way of speaking. They talk in bizarre, high-pitched, wildly enthusiastic cadences accompanied by strange, rigid posture and awkward, jerky head movements. Interestingly, this iconic alien behavior was never actually written in the original script. The entire vocal identity of the Thermians was completely invented on the fly during the casting and rehearsal process by actress Missy Pyle and the rest of the alien cast. During an early table read, the actors were playing around with different ways to make their characters feel genuinely non-human without relying entirely on heavy prosthetic makeup. One of the actors accidentally let out a strange, high-pitched vocal squeak due to a dry throat, and it immediately caught the director's attention. The cast began actively experimenting with that exact vocal restriction, realizing that a strained, overly enthusiastic, and completely unmodulated pitch perfectly conveyed the alien's total lack of guile and complete inability to comprehend the concept of lying or deception. The Chompers were a literal middle finger to the studio. One of the absolute most famous, intensely stressful, and visually hilarious sequences in the entire movie involves the Chompers, a completely nonsensical, highly dangerous corridor filled with massive, crushing industrial pistons that serve absolutely no logical purpose on the spaceship. This entire sequence was actually born out of pure, unadulterated, creative frustration and served as a direct, literal middle finger to the studio executives from the screenwriters. During the writing process, DreamWorks executives kept sending a constant stream of tedious notes, demanding that the script include more generic, high-octane action beats and cheap, artificial obstacles to keep the pacing fast. Frustrated by this constant corporate interference, writer Robert Gordon wrote the Chompers into the script as an intentional joke to mock the absolute stupidity of generic action movie tropes. He explicitly had Sigourney Weaver's character scream out loud about how incredibly poorly written and completely illogical the obstacle was. To the writer's absolute amusement, the studio executives completely missed the meta-satire entirely, loved the dangerous sequence, and insisted that it be built as a massive, highly expensive practical set. Industrial Light and Magic treated it like a real Star Wars film. Because this movie was explicitly a comedy parody, you might assume that the special effects would be handled by a secondary, low-budget effects house, or designed to look intentionally cheap and cheesy. Instead, the production managed to secure the legendary Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, the world-renowned visual effects company famously created by George Lucas to produce the Star Wars franchise. Rather than treating the comedy project like a minor, throwaway side job, the visual effects artists at ILM approached the film with absolute total seriousness. They utilized the exact same cutting-edge digital technology, high-end model making, and intense attention to detail that they were actively using at the time for Star Wars Episode I: The Phantom Menace. The model makers meticulously constructed gorgeous, highly detailed physical miniatures of the NSEA protector, and the digital animators spent months perfecting the complex lighting, reflections, and fluid physics of space travel. This high-level dedication created an incredible visual juxtaposition. The special effects looked so genuinely spectacular, epic, and cinematic that it made the comedic performances of the clueless, terrified actors on screen 10 times funnier. The rock monster was a nightmare of foam and broken regrets. The intense battle scene on the alien planet, featuring the terrifying Gorignac, a massive, sentient monster made entirely out of jagged, living desert rocks, is a major visual highlight of the film. While the final creature looks absolutely seamless on screen, thanks to a brilliant mix of early computer-generated imagery and practical effects, shooting that sequence was an absolute, unmitigated nightmare for the crew. The production crew constructed a massive, incredibly heavy, full-scale practical version of the rock monster out of dense foam, wire framing, and heavy materials so that Tim Allen would have a real physical object to interact with on location in the blazing hot desert. However, the practical monster was an absolute disaster to operate. The desert heat caused the internal mechanics to constantly melt. The heavy foam pieces kept breaking off during takes, and the puppet was so incredibly awkward and slow to move that it looked completely ridiculous rather than terrifying. The director grew so deeply frustrated with the broken, malfunctioning foam monstrosity that the vast majority of the practical footage had to be completely scrapped, forcing ILM to hastily recreate the creature digitally under immense time pressure. Steven Spielberg personally saved the aspect ratio gag. The movie features an incredibly brilliant, highly subtle cinematic joke right at the very beginning of the film that many casual viewers might not even actively notice on a conscious level. When the movie opens, the scenes taking place at the bleak, depressing sci-fi convention are presented in a narrow, boxy, old-school 1.8, 5:1 television aspect ratio. The moment Tim Allen's character steps out into the garage and beholds a real, massive alien spaceship, the film screen literally and physically expands horizontally into a grand, sweeping, cinematic 2.35:1 widescreen format. This complex visual gag was incredibly difficult to pull off technically in movie theaters at the time, and studio executives heavily pressured the director to cut it, believing it was an unnecessary, confusing gimmick that would alienate general audiences. However, legendary filmmaker Steven Spielberg, who was a co-founder of DreamWorks Studio, saw an early rough cut of the film and was so completely blown away by the sheer brilliance of the aspect ratio transition that he personally stepped in, overruled the skeptical executives, and demanded that the visual gag remain completely untouched. The F-bomb that had to be digitally scrubbed. During the highly intense, nail-biting chomper sequence, Sigourney Weaver's character looks at the terrifying, crushing mechanical pistons and screams out a line that officially stands in the theatrical cut as, "Forget that!" However, if you watch her mouth very closely during that exact shot, it is blindingly obvious that she is actually screaming a massive, highly enthusiastic profanity. Screw that! The scene was originally filmed when the movie was still tracking toward its dark, edgy R-rated cut, and Weaver delivered the line with total, unfiltered intensity. When the studio forced the filmmakers to edit the movie down to a family-friendly PG rating to maximize ticket sales, that specific line became a massive corporate crisis. Because they didn't have the time or budget to completely reshoot the expensive visual effects sequence, the sound editors had to digitally scrub her original vocal track and awkwardly dub the clean word "forget" directly over her lips, resulting in one of the most famously obvious, hilarious, and poorly hidden lip-sync mismatches in modern cinematic history. What incredible reaction did this goofy parody receive from the actual legendary actors who inspired it? Patrick Stewart refused to see it until he loved it. Sir Patrick Stewart, famous globally for playing the ultra-serious, deeply dignified Captain Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek: The Next Generation, was initially incredibly hostile toward the very existence of this movie. When he first heard about the production, he genuinely believed it was going to be a cheap, mean-spirited, and highly insulting mockery of his life's work, and the dedicated sci-fi fan community that he cared about deeply. Because of this deep skepticism, he completely refused to go to the theater to see it. However, after being relentlessly badgered by his fellow actors and friends who assured him it was brilliant, Stewart finally relented and sat down to watch it. He was so completely caught off guard by how incredibly smart, affectionate, and deeply respectful the parody actually was that he ended up laughing uproariously through the entire screening. Stewart later publicly admitted that he felt the movie completely captured the absolute reality of what it is like to be a veteran sci-fi television actor, famously stating that he found the film to be an absolute cinematic masterpiece. The Thermian language is a real, fully functioning dialect. The bizarre, guttural screeching sounds that the Thermian aliens make when they are communicating with each other behind closed doors sound like complete, randomized gibberish thrown together by the actors on set. In reality, the creative team went to the extreme length of hiring professional linguists to construct a legitimate, fully functioning, and structurally consistent alien dialect for the Thermian race. The language wasn't just random noise. It possessed its own specific grammatical rules, unique sentence structures, and distinct vocabulary lists that the actors actually had to study, memorize, and practice extensively before filming began. During the intense rehearsal periods, the alien actors would practice speaking the complex constructed language to each other to build a natural, fluid chemistry. Even though the vast majority of the constructed language was ultimately cut from the final theatrical version of the film to keep the pacing brisk, you can still hear the actors using the authentic, structured dialect during several background scenes, adding a dense layer of world-building realism to the absurd comedy. George Takei's surprisingly emotional reaction. George Takei, the legendary actor who portrayed Hikaru Sulu in the original, groundbreaking Star Trek television series, had an incredibly profound and surprisingly emotional reaction to watching the film. Takei was deeply familiar with the complex, often volatile real-world dynamics of the original cast, including the notorious, decades-long backstage tensions and public feuds surrounding William Shatner's immense ego and leadership style. When Takei watched Tim Allen's brilliant portrayal of Jason Nesmith, an arrogant, self-centered captain who completely ignores his crew members until he is brutally forced to recognize their immense value, he was absolutely stunned by how incredibly accurate the commentary was. Takei publicly praised the film, laughing that he spent the entire movie nudging the person sitting next to him and whispering that the on-screen antics were an exact, literal documentary of his actual life. He deeply appreciated that the movie didn't just mock the franchise, but beautifully highlighted the deep, unbreakable bond that ultimately forms between cast members who share a legendary sci-fi legacy together. The tragic reason we never got Galaxy Quest II. For over 2 decades, fans have aggressively clamored for a legitimate, full-scale sequel or a premium television revival to continue the adventures of the NSEA Protector crew. The script for a follow-up project was actually incredibly close to becoming a concrete reality. Around 2015, the original creative team and the entire main cast had officially signed on to develop a massive sequel series for a major streaming platform, with a brilliantly clever script that would have brought the aging actors back together for another meta-layered space mission. Tragically, the entire project was permanently derailed and completely cancelled in January 2016 due to the devastating, untimely passing of legendary co-star Alan Rickman. The cast and creative team were so completely heartbroken by the loss of their dear friend that they unanimously agreed it would be completely impossible, disrespectful, and creatively hollow to ever attempt a sequel without the irreplaceable presence of Alexander Dane and his iconic alien persona, Dr. Lazarus. Did this low-budget parody manage to achieve the ultimate, unthinkable, holy grail of sci-fi validation? Voted the 7th best Star Trek movie ever made. The absolute ultimate testament to the incredible brilliance and lasting cultural legacy of this film occurred in 2013 at a massive official internal Star Trek convention in Las Vegas. Thousands of hardcore, lifelong Star Trek fans gathered together to rank every single official feature film in the historic franchise's catalog up to that point. In a shocking, completely unprecedented move that stunned the entire entertainment industry, the passionate fan community collectively voted to include this movie on the ballot, despite it not being an official part of the Paramount franchise. When the final votes were formally tallied, the film placed higher than several multi-million-dollar official entries, officially ranking as the 7th best Star Trek movie ever made. This legendary, historic vote permanently cemented the film's unique cultural status. It is no longer viewed by pop culture as a mere parody, but as a legitimate, deeply beloved, and fully embraced masterpiece of the genre that understands the true heart and soul of science fiction better than most actual sci-fi films ever could. At the end of the day, Galaxy Quest succeeded because it never punched down. It took a chaotic production, a major studio identity crisis, and a completely absurd premise, and spun them into cinematic gold. It stands as a timeless reminder that sometimes the crazy stories happening behind the camera are just as magical as the ones projected on the screen. Never give up. Never surrender. Never give up. Never surrender. The definitive success and enduring legacy of Galaxy Quest lies in a brilliant narrative paradox. It remains the greatest cinematic love letter to science fiction precisely because it is a merciless parody of it. Released during the crowded holiday box office corridor of December 1999, the film defied a deeply muddled studio marketing campaign and a highly disruptive PG rating edit to emerge as a commercial and critical triumph. Grossing over $90 million worldwide against its $45 million budget, it captured the hearts of mainstream audiences and established an immediate, passionate cult following. What elevates the film from a standard, disposable 90s studio comedy into a timeless cinematic masterpiece is its foundational rule of narrative execution. The creative team chose to treat the absurd space opera elements with absolute unironic seriousness. By securing top-tier visual effects from Industrial Light and Magic and a powerhouse ensemble cast, the film functions beautifully as a thrilling, legitimate sci-fi adventure if you entirely excise the jokes. However, the true masterstroke of its legacy is its visionary, ahead-of-its-time deconstruction of fandom. In an era where mainstream Hollywood media routinely mocked nerds, geeks, and convention-goers as socially awkward caricatures, Galaxy Quest flipped the narrative script entirely. It subverted the classic trope of the toxic or obsessive fan by turning Justin Long's character, Brandon, and his network of dedicated sci-fi nerds into the literal tactical heroes who save the day. The film brilliantly honors the profound power of storytelling, validating the idea that the fictional narratives we consume can deeply shape reality, build genuine communities, and inspire real-world heroism. This authentic empathy earned the ultimate validation from the very industry it parodied. Legendary Star Trek icons, including Patrick Stewart, George Takei, and Will Wheaton, have publicly lauded the film, praising its staggering accuracy in capturing the complex, fragile egos of typecast television actors and the intense culture of fandom. Its permanent enshrinement in pop culture history was forever cemented when hardcore Trekkies formally voted it the seventh best Star Trek film ever made at an official convention. Galaxy Quest proves that a movie born out of total studio chaos can still become absolute cinematic gold. By treating its sci-fi source material with genuine love instead of cheap mockery, it earned a permanent spot in the pop culture cosmos. It's a hilarious, heartfelt reminder that sometimes the craziest behind-the-scenes stories make for the most magical films. If you love diving deep into iconic films and shows, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next deep dive into movie history.